Fruits are extremely difficult things to grow well over and over again. They have lots of interesting problems, but they're fun. So that's part of the reason we're doing this. The problems that you really are going to face are primarily those of climatic issues for a lot of places. There are places where you can grow almost anything, but if you're too far away from a big body of water, too far away from the lakes, or in my area, in the Traverse City area, too far away from the big inland lakes, there's a 10 or 15 degree difference in winter minimum temperatures. We get minus 15 was the lowest I had at a good fruit site this winter. It was minus 35, 20 miles away from there. So it's going to make a huge difference as to what crops you can even attempt to grow. And so it's that combined with things like your frost-free period are all going to be important because a lot of fruit crops are pretty long season crops. So you're familiar with zone issues and stuff. You can look things up and figure out what might work in your area. Michigan State has worked for many years to try to figure out some of these details and publish some of this stuff in various places. This is from work for wine grapes. Wine grapes almost always have to have at least 165 or more days of frost-free. So you can see it kind of limits where most of those can go. But it depends on the variety. And it's always going to depend on the variety because some stuff is incredibly cold hardy and others are quick. Things like cherries are harvested by the end of July most times. So certain fruit crops come in quick and go out quick. We're going to just kind of run through this sort of stuff for each group. So some of it's going to apply over and over again. So we're going to start here. Site selection is nice if you can choose, from ground zero where you're going to do this. But like my property at home, I own the place already. I don't have a lot of site selection choices, but I do have different microclimates within my site, and you probably do too. But given what you have to work with, then you have to come up with some kind of choice of planting material and know how to plant it and deal with pollination and cultural practices. The number one thing to avoid, which is true for your vegetable gardens and everything else, is the lowest point in your site will pool cold air, unless you happen to have a complete slope and it goes into your neighbor's site or somewhere else. But you got to avoid places that are frost pockets where cold air accumulates. Anything above that zone generally will do much better. And you'll find that, just like with other garden plants, there's some that you might be able to hedge the bet. They could go a little closer to the cold weather or the cold zone, and certain varieties of things will have to be on the top or the peaks of hills. My little property is 2 acres. I can have a 10-degree difference between the top of a hill and the bottom, so in the winter. It's pretty amazing. Fruits of all sorts, doesn't matter what they are going to do a lot better in full sun. And that doesn't mean that you can't grow a few things around the corners and some shade part of the day, but if you're really after some kind of production and really high quality fruit, the more sun you can get to them, the better. I've actually taken out a couple of spruces that shade a piece of the garden in the last couple of years, and it improves the view of the backyard as well, so it was a good double reason for that. But you actually do get higher quality fruit, not just in its fresh form, but the longer storage life. This stuff has better surface texture to the skins and things. It'll stand up longer in refrigerated or non-refrigerated storage if it's grown under sunnier conditions. Soils. Most of the area of the state I work in has got pretty much sandy to sandy loam soils, and it's not an issue. And most fruit growing works best in that kind of material. The more clay you get into the soils, the worse it is for most of the small fruits and certainly tree fruits as well. If it holds water too much, gets mushy and stays mushy, or has any kind of trapped water table where the root zone doesn't dry out, it's not going to be a site for fruits unless you try to work with some kind of raised beds, which is done for a lot of small fruits. So, starting with tree fruits, most of the tree fruits do better between 6 to 7, 5.5 to 7. They don't like it acid, they don't like it very basic. So that's the zone you'd be looking at, and it can be adjusted a little bit with various means, but if you have sites that are naturally acid, you might and you really want to have some fun, you might consider things like blueberries. The variety selection is going to be somewhat personal preference, of course. You may remember something that you had that you just would love to grow it again. You may have grown up with something on a property in a parent's or grandparent's place. So a lot of times we start out with a goal. Damn it, I want Red Haven peaches. Okay? But you may find that, again, the best place to get those is going to be the farmer's market. It might be a couple of 3 other different varieties of peaches that will actually grow in your particular site. What's the intended use? Fun, fresh harvest, enough to preserve and process. You want to make wine out of them. All those things have different goals as far as how high a quality the fruit has to be. You can get by with some pretty rugged looking stuff if your primary goal are juices, jams, jellies, and things like that. And then, of course, winter hardiness. You want to have an investment that's in that ground that is going to last. You might get through 4 or 5 years, and then suddenly you get the challenge year, like the last 2 years. And you find out that, you know, the choice was wrong, but it may take 5 years to find out your choice is wrong. Sizes. When you talk about tree fruits, you can start getting some pretty big trees, and you might be working with small spaces. So they are available in different forms based on the rootstocks that they're grafted onto. The typical categories are full-size, semi-dwarf, and dwarf. But in the modern world of fruit crops, there are literally dozens, sometimes 50 or more different rootstocks available to put under an apple tree, for instance. And they all impart slightly different size. They may even impart slightly different pace of maturity to bearing fruit. And some of them also can be used to tolerate different soil conditions. It's really quite confusing on the broad spectrum of things. This is where I really don't have a lot of knowledge, and that would be in the specifics of selection. But I do know that dwarf trees, usually come into bearing earlier, a great feature. Usually stay small enough if you prune them accurately and properly that you'll never need a ladder to pick one. And they fit nicer in the landscape if they're also part of the aesthetics, a beautiful blooming tree in the spring, things like that. If they're not monstrous and shading out your other plants and blocking your view of other things, they're much nicer. After that point, I highly encourage you to choose things that are known to be resistant to certain diseases. Spraying is just something you hate to do. It's not only hazardous but difficult and expensive. The more you can do by choosing resistant varieties to eliminate problems from this fruit planting is extremely important. There are several apple varieties now that just completely are immune to apple scab, and that is a miracle thing. They may not be the favorite variety of the past. They may not have quite the same characteristics of some of the apples you'd love to have, but if you can grow them year after year without apple scab, it's a tremendous boost, and it's a lot of fun to avoid problems like that. So the nursery catalogs, if they're good ones anyway, will have lists of everything that that particular cultivar is relatively resistant to or susceptible to, and it's really important to review and try to figure out that kind of information. Here's a late season fruit that's apple scab resistant, and this one's actually really got pretty decent flavor. Liberty is one that I would certainly look into. There's a few hundred other apple varieties we could talk about, but that's how this has to be. We just have to jump through the ones that we can get through. In cherries, again, worldwide, there's maybe 50 or 60 varieties of sweet cherries you could possibly get a hold of. And in the United States, nurseries probably have 30 or 40 of them. Here I would search for things that are self-fertile, meaning it doesn't have to have a different variety for cross-pollination. Flowers of lapins have pollen that pollinate lapins readily, so you don't have to have a separate variety. In some tree fruits you do. So look for self-fertile. You'd love to get stuff that's resistant to splitting, and a lot of sweet cherries, as soon as they get a rain on them when they're approaching ripeness, will split, and then you get all kinds of diseases following that. So a resistant to splitting cultivar type would be great. Color, you can get everything from small yellow fruits to large red, large black, so that doesn't matter so much. But really seek self-fertile, split resistance, and if you can find anything in the cherries that have disease resistance, that'd be great, but there are very few cherries that have any kind of decent disease resistance. Here's another one that we recommend these days for home gardens called Skeena, and really very resistant to cracking and self-fertile, so it's, but there could be others. If you get into seriously thinking about apples, cherries, peaches, whatever, I suggest connecting with MSU Extension folks or other sources, doesn't have to be MSU, other state university areas, things like that, to get recommendations, because they all may have a experience with one or two varieties. So it's really important to ask more than one person, because in order to have some kind of knowledge of the whole scope of things, you got to get in touch with a lot of different people and a lot of different resources. There's a lot of plums available for home garden production, home orchard production. Plums have really exploded in diversity in the last 20 or 30 years. It's not just the old blue Stanley plum, and you can have all kinds of fun with plums now. This is one of the ones that was recommended by a downstate agent who put part of this talk together a few years ago. Plums do have a number of really significant diseases. Bacterial canker and leaf spot are really big, so if you can find some that are tolerant or resistant to that, it's pretty important. I haven't mentioned anything about insects yet. There's going to be a whole lot of insect pests of tree fruits that you'll deal with over and over again, and you'll find that virtually none of the varieties have any particular resistance or tolerance to those insect pests. Here's another another plum variety. This one is sensitive to leaf spot, so there are things to watch out for there. Black knot disease is very, very common throughout the state on plums, and so tolerant to that would be a super plus. In the world of peaches, it used to just be 5 or 6 varieties, and now there are literally several dozen interesting peach varieties. And you can go for the traditional look, you can go for peaches that have a white flesh. They now have peaches that they look almost like a donut. They're compressed from the top to the bottom. I don't know why they did that, but those are available. And the key in peaches is, again, they have significant troubles with bacterial spot. And so anything that is relatively resistant to that would be a big plus. Red Haven is the classic peach of all time, but it's extremely hard to grow without a significant amount of pesticides. And so I would not pick it for a home garden site. I wouldn't pick any other variety over it in a commercial setting, in a big farm setting. But there's a whole bundle that came out from a gentleman in southern Michigan, and most of them are named Flaming something or Fury something. And many of these have tremendous winter hardy characteristics. This is one of them here, PF17 Flamin' Fury. So this guy's name was Paul Friday, who bred all these. And you can probably find him on the web and look at all the different peach varieties that he has available. So there are many other trees we could discuss. But to get to the basics of it here, you'll be looking for good nursery stock that hopefully has been tested and can be certified as being disease-free from viruses and things. Container grown or potted, 2 different versions that are typically available. Container grown stuff is usually in better shape. And often when you buy mail order, you end up getting bare rooted trees anyway. Although you can mail order the other ones, it's just much more expensive. You can consider the shipping weight and everything. So you're either going to start with typically a container grown plant or a bare root plant. Somewhere on those plants, in most cases, there's going to be an obvious graft union, and sometimes it's marked with a particular band of paint. But a lot of times the paint markings just are for the nursery's purposes of knowing a bundle of trees or a batch of trees came from the same place or have the same rootstock. So you do need to kind of hunt for where the rootstock joint is, and it's usually visible as a little swelling or a specific area where you can tell there's a difference in the bark tissues. And that rootstock that rootstock joint where the graft union is should be about 2 to 3 inches above the soil line. And when the final soil line is taken care of. And the reason for that is if you get soil over the graft union, the top part, known as the scion, the variety thing that you're trying to have there, may root. And if it roots, it'll overtake the rooting effect of the rootstock, and you'll end up with whatever that tree wants to be in terms of size, a full-size tree, essentially. You need to keep the scion from having any chance of rooting when you plant these. Same kind of process as planting ornamental trees. The soil volume that you remove and perhaps modify is 3 times the width of the root ball. Make sure you have good root spread as it's being planted, and settling the soil with water and tamping as it's going in. There's nothing different than planting a fruit tree it is from planting ornamental trees. So, fertilization depends a lot on what you got. So I can't get into the real details of that, but the first things is a lot of them have tags, little bands on them. Get those off of there so you don't have any trouble with them girdling as they grow. Pruning immediately is actually done in most cases, and it depends on what your eventual goal is for that tree. If they come as a tall whip, usually it depends on how much you spend. If you spend less, you get a single whip that might be a certain height. And what's typically done is they're cut off at 2 to 3 feet, maybe 4, to encourage bud break below that point. So that season's growth will be lateral stuff instead of continuing going up. The more you spend, the more you can get what's known as a feathered tree, which means that first few steps were done in the nursery and they arrive to you with lateral branches. And that's a great starting point if you can get there. Cherries, apples, plums, they all want to be dealt with slightly differently when it comes to that pruning cut after planting. So you, again, got some homework to do, and I can't teach it all here in an hour. Whether or not they need to be fertilized immediately also depends on how good they were coming from the nurseries. Nurseries that really do a great job, there's a lot of reserve nutrients already in that root system and in that trunk. And they can act, in grapes, for instance, we typically don't fertilize at all in year 1, and they still grow like crazy because they have excellent stored nutrients. So, 2 to 3 gallons of water per tree every 7 to 14 days, unless you're getting that inch of rainfall kind of stuff per week. And in the first year, they have very minimal soil contact with their roots, small root systems haven't got established, so drought stress is a very real and possible thing. You'll find that in later years, if you have decent rainfall and once you get an extensive root system to them, they don't require a great deal of water unless you're pushing for all the production you can get, which should be done on a commercial scale, but probably not done in a home scale. Now, there's 2 life stages to your average plant, tree fruit. There's the non-bearing stage, and it may be from 3 to 8 years, depending on whether you're dealing with dwarfing rootstocks or standard size. One of the big reasons that dwarfing rootstocks are so popular is not just their size, but that they come into bearing earlier. A standard size apple tree, old traditional type, would not carry much fruit on it until it was year 6 or 7. So you really have to wait. But those first few years, you get a lot of rapid growth. You're expanding trunk diameter. You're trying to encourage root development and branch structure. And basically, you don't want fruit production for the first 2 or 3 years. After they're done blooming, or at some point, just take all the fruit off of it to make sure that it spends its energy getting established. Once you get them up to the bearing stage, that's when you can start carrying a lot more fruit. The growth is slowed greatly by the crop load. And if you crop them too heavy too early, some of them will runt out. They won't come back. You get one bad year where you cropped them too hard when they were too young, and they'll suffer the rest of their existence. So be patient and don't crop them hard early. Pruning is something that's important to every fruit crop. The tree fruits is extensively important, and much more so than the others, because of the permanent structure that you've got is very big and woody. And they can grow so much larger than a bush crop can. So you really need to work with pruning to keep them in a range that's useful to you. And pruning is slightly different for all of these different tree fruit types. So again, there are basics of it, and that is you're trying to get old or injured wood out, you're trying to avoid having things crossing branches, trying to make sure it's not too clogged with branch material or foliage or fruit in any one area. But the nuances are different between apples and cherries and peaches and things. So it's something that if you get chances to go to little seminars about pruning and things, which are held by companies and Michigan State and things, it would really be worth it to spend some time specifically learning pruning for a particular tree crop. Most of it's done dormant season. Right about now is a really peak time of pruning in Traverse City area because the snow is finally down low enough. And the summertime, about the only thing that's done is to remove those really vigorous upright shoots that grow that are called water sprouts. But typically no other pruning in the summer. It's usually all dormant season. And the key is you want good spacing of branches, both vertically and around the diameter of the trunk. You want to shoot for branches that have wide angle connections to the main parent wood, to the trunk or the larger branches, because these are much sturdier, can bear a snow load and a fruit load better than anything that's got a tight angle. Those split very easily. But those are the basics, and after that there's lots and lots of stuff. So in order to get through everything I've got to do here, we're going to move on. Older trees. There's specific bulletins and videos available on renovating old trees, old fruit trees. That's the way to go to get that information. I kind of said that. Later on fertilizer, it's really a kind of watch and see process for a lot of tree fruits. If you get a foot of growth, new growth every year on a cherry, you're right where you want to be. If you're getting 2 foot, if the fertilization is too high. If you're getting less than a foot, it's probably a little low or your water is a little low. So it's not always done with a soil test, although a soil test will tell you very important things about how much potassium and how much phosphorus and things like that you need. In order to get a good judge of nitrogen needs, it's more dialing it into growth or doing it from foliar analysis, which it's a process for sampling leaves and sending it in to get an idea of what your actual percentage by weight of nitrogen is in the foliage. When you are fertilizing, whenever you figure out what you're going to use, it only needs to be in the drip line area of trees. The root systems are a little more extensive than that, but the vast majority of them will be under the drip line of the trees. So. Pollination, and this applies to all the fruits ahead except for grapes. You do need pollinators to get it done. Even if it's a self-fruitful tree, you still have to have a bug or something moving that pollen from flower to flower. So avoid sprays during bloom, because you not only want to keep your bees alive, but you want to keep them active there. Encouraging bees in the area, both native bees and honeybees, with diverse planting of other flowers and other materials and things like that. A bee-friendly environment can be established. Michigan State University is just now starting a major native pollinator project, so there's going to be all kinds of new stuff coming along, we hope, in terms of information and opportunities to learn about it in the next few years. All right, pest management. Again, this is what we start with here. We'll cover many fruits later, so I'm spending a little more time with it here. Disease resistance. That is the key thing. Proper planting site, because a tree that's in a good site will be able to overcome certain things. The worse the site is, the more stresses there are on them, and the door is opened for other issues then. Good horticultural practices for the same reason. If you don't maintain good health in the trees, there are many things can attack. Sanitation has to do with dealing with diseased or waste material like fallen fruits, even branch prunings if there are diseased prunings. Get them away from the planting. They don't have to be a long way away, but certainly just don't leave things drop and sit under the trees. Take them off to some other site, chop up branches into the compost bins, whatever you do with them, but don't leave them lay around there where a disease might be able to readily move back into, or the plant or insects readily move back in. And then if you have to, well-timed pesticide applications. And if you're really going to shoot for a decent amount of fruit off of a home garden planting, you'll probably have to do some spraying from time to time. You just like to avoid stuff like this, although that fruit, you know, if you took the time to peel it, would still be good for applesauce. And we have 5 trees that came with my property. I never would have planted fruit on this property. We do nothing to them. They bear a really nice crop every 2 or 3 years. The animals love it, and occasionally we have made some pretty decent apple butter off of those things with absolutely no input whatsoever. So I know it can be done. I just wouldn't recommend it. So the good horticultural practices: fertilization as appropriate, good pruning, good weeding, clean up. You don't want to just leave these fruits laying around here. And you also don't want to leave fruits that cling into the trees through the winter there either. Many of those are places where fruit diseases are going to go through the winter time and be ready to start spreading into the young growth of the spring when things start over again. All right. Most of the most pesticide use in fruit is 2 different categories really. For diseases, it's very much a protective approach. Fighting back after infection doesn't work well with diseases, but with insects, it's very possible to wait and see what's going on. You do need to understand what pests you're up against and what you're expecting. And then the difference between a direct and an indirect pest. The definition there is simple, that if it attacks the fruit itself, the part that you want to harvest and enjoy, that's a direct pest. An indirect pest will be attacking all the other parts, leaves, stems, trunks, etc. So you have a different tolerance level for those things that are attacking fruit, say an egg, and may not have succeeded. Again, surface blemish only unless the grub hatches and tunnels inside, which happens to softer fruits usually. So this is one of the biggest problems in plums, peaches, and cherries. It's not as big a deal in apples. There are many other things, however, that have their own particular things. Apple maggot will attack all the apple family plants and pear, and cherry fruit fly, all the different cherry varieties. These become internal maggots. You don't want to find those, right, when you're working with these fruits. So these are the ones they'll probably make you spray more than anybody else for insects, is to try to keep the apple maggot and cherry maggot out of their respective fruits. And that combined with a little bit of work against plum curculio. Most of the other insects will either be relatively minor or really easily seen on the outside. If you know that there's something going on, it's not a big surprise. That's okay. You drop that fruit and get rid of it. It's the ones that you don't know that are in there that you really don't like. And the fruit flies, the egg scar itself is almost invisible, so you don't find out there's a damaged fruit until you essentially cut into it or bite into it. So some of them are cryptic, and others are easy to find out if they're there or not. So there are several dozen other moths and caterpillars and beetles, but the important ones are those direct fruit infesting types. Codling moth does attack fruits directly, but it's one of the ones that leaves a really obvious problem, a little hole and a little pile of crud on the outside. So you can go through at different points in the year and actually be just taking off those fruits that are damaged, and it ends up being like thinning. The rest of the fruits that are good will continue to grow. That's how organic orchardists deal with codling moth and with plum curculio. We'll find that organic orchardists have never been successful in Michigan in dealing with the fruit flies. So then there's a bunch of caterpillars and other creatures. Spider mites are really bad problems on some fruit trees, so that's one you'll be watching for. And there's a number of trunk pests. They'll come in at wounds on trunks or even on healthy trunks on some types of trees. And being on the guard for what their symptoms look like is real important. The fruit diseases are the same. There are some that directly attack the fruit and some that just attack the foliage. Identification is much more critical with these because the disease practices are a little bit more specific You can pick the wrong practice relatively easy if you don't have a really good identification of what's going wrong. Preventative control measures for diseases, much more important than with insects. You really have to do a lot of things based on weather, saying we're going into a period when it's likely to be an infection of a certain disease, and be ready for it if you're going to try to do it with sprays. The main diseases of tree fruits are things like cankers on trunks and branches, mildews on foliage and on fruits, a lot of leaf spotting funguses. The majority of the leaf spot and fruit spotting funguses attack in certain time frames of the year, so at least you don't have to worry about the whole season. And they also have to have moisture on the fruit or the leaves, direct droplets of moisture. So it's really important that you do under tree irrigation and not get the foliage wet. And if you have lawn irrigation, that occasionally, lawn irrigation is always above. If it's spraying any portions of the trees or shrubs, it greatly encourages these kind of spotting diseases. So whether you're growing fruit or not, watch out for lawn irrigation wetting the lower parts of foliage of trees and shrubs. Apple scab will be the main one in apples that you'll deal with. And again, excellent ways to get around it with resistant varieties. In cherries, you're going to be, and plums and peaches really, you're going to be mainly looking at brown rot as a fungal disease. Nothing you can do to avoid it. Some years it's going to be there no matter what you do. The key thing again is really not letting the foliage be too dense or the fruit crop be too dense. If the cherries are just touching each other all over the place like we get in a super bumper crop year in Traverse City area, brown rot's a tremendous issue because there's no way for the fruit surface to dry off. It's always surrounded by moisture or high humidity. There's going to be a few things in peaches and plums that actually attack the leaves and cause really weird distortions. You'll never forget it after you see it. It's called peach leaf curl. They usually outgrow it though. It's usually just the first leaves of the year that look terrible, but there are treatments for it as well. And then in plums and sometimes cherries, you get this black knot on things. And this is a bacterial spot on peach. It looks similar on plums. Again, it is just a surface issue, but it's a really ugly surface issue. So if you can get fruits that are resistant to this to start with, it's very good. There are very, very few sprays available, no matter how much you like to spray, if you're in that category, for bacterial diseases of fruits. So it's really a hard stuff to manage unless you set the system up to be, as free of it as possible in the first place. You can also get some crown galls and leaf spots on cherries from bacteria. Fire blight is a really important bacterial issue. The farther south you are in Michigan, the more humid and warmer it is, the greater the risk is for fire blight on susceptible fruit crops. As far as you go north into the cooler climate zones, it's not a big issue. All right. I think I've kind of emphasized some of this on the way through here. All right. Yeah, that's a super quick run through tree fruit. And we're going to be even faster on the rest of these. All right. If you're into the home garden fruit, brambles is one of the ways to go. They're easy to manage compared to tree fruits. They take up far less space. You can have a lot of cool little varieties in a row and take care of them all similarly in some regards. They ripen at different points during the year, so you can pick different varieties out and kind of have a nice run of different fruits for a period of time. Blackberries and raspberries are the two common ones. And then there's both blackberry and black raspberry, and you can tell those apart by some of the structures of the fruits. Same issues. Don't put them in the low-lying areas. They get verticillium wilt, and so does strawberry, and so does potato and tomato-related plants. So if you're following an area that's had tomatoes or potatoes or strawberries for a good amount of time, it wouldn't be a great place to put brambles. And vice versa, if you had a bramble area for 4 or 5 years or something and you want to change, I wouldn't go to those other alternate hosts for verticillium wilt. They really need well-drained sites. brambles will not stand areas that have squishy feet. High organic matter content is very favored, but they grow okay in relatively bleak sands. They certainly can do it. If you're interested in red raspberries and black raspberries and all these things, there's I think 3 or 4 main kinds. One is so-called summer bearing, and this is the traditional old-style raspberry or blackberry. There's a seasonal cycle to these things, and if they kind of come up in July, mid-season, June, July, those are the ones that have always been called summer bearing, and I'll explain why there are different terms in a second. This old varieties, Canby and Latham, these have been around since I was a kid. They're still amongst the best for standard summertime red raspberries. Logan and Jewel have been around forever for black raspberries, and they're probably still amongst the best ones. Fall-bearing raspberries have a seasonal cycle that runs on a different schedule, and they ripen in late August into September, even later than that. But the reason that they are extremely popular is they're much easier to care for. And we'll show you that in just a second why. And Heritage has been around for a long time. Fall Gold is a really cool one with a different color. So there's lots of these out there now. Then there's a whole bunch of different so-called erect blackberries. They grow upright and they can be kept upright with a little bit of trellising. The other version is trailing blackberries that like to just run on the ground. And those are really hard to take care of. But there's several of them out there. You could say, wow, there's raspberries growing in the woods, why don't I go get some plants? Because they are in the woods all over Michigan. Wild brambles typically are heavily disease infested with viral diseases. Viruses cannot be rogued out of a plant, can't be sprayed out of one, can't be pruned out of one. Once they have it, it's throughout the entire plant. So if you were to take cuttings or plants from that area that are probably root-related growth, you would bring those home with you. The viruses extremely reduce the crop size and the quality of the fruit without killing the plant, so the plants look fine. But if you want decent home fruit, you should start with virus-free planting material. Again, it comes in various forms, various costs, all kinds of things. Typically, you grow them in long hedgerows, but they don't need to be done that way. That's just the way they are done commercially. You can do them in little hills and so many feet apart, so that even when they start spreading out with fruit on them, you can still walk around them. You can do them here and there in a garden setting. They don't have to be organized in any particular place. My raspberries are on the back side of a split rail fence, and I have a regular flower garden stuff on the front side of it. For the ones that tend to get tall and heavy and flop over, really simple trellis systems to keep them from falling over is all that's necessary. I'm going to just skip this one for the moment because there's other places to look that up. Because I want to get to how they're different in terms of management. A summer-bearing raspberry, whether it's a red raspberry or black raspberry, grows a cane in year 1, and it's usually tipped, and it will grow a few side laterals depending on what variety it is, but there's no fruit on that cane in year 1. They're called primo canes. That overwinters, so it has to make it through a winter, so there might be cold injury issues. The next year, the little laterals on that thing actually become the fruiting structures. So there's a 2-year cycle. Every year you're growing up a set of new ones and fruiting last year's. So you have to prune selectively. You're only taking out the ones that have finished fruiting because they die off. So it makes you manage a lot more. There's certainly plenty of varieties and it works really well. The same is true for black and purple raspberries. They're these summer-bearing types. Fall-bearing raspberries grow up from the ground, flower, fruit, harvest, all in one season. You carry nothing over to the next year. So you can literally mow them down with a mower once you're done harvesting. Nothing has to survive the winter above the ground level, so snow cover keeps them safe and cozy. No winter kill issues. So that's why the fall-bearing stuff has become popular. Just a completely different cycle to it, and much easier. scooting right along. There are a whole bunch of insect pests and brambles as well. The insects are out there. They're, as previous speaker said, they're all our friends. We have to live with them. And they're all probably doing something interesting that we don't even appreciate half the time. But there are a bundle of them that do attack the fruits directly. Sap beetles being the #1 problem probably in raspberries in terms of directly impacting the fruit. The rest of them are stem and leaf feeders primarily. Some of them are fairly important if you get raspberry crown borers, which looks like a yellow jacket, but that's a moth. It's got great mimicry of yellow jackets to keep it from being attacked by birds. This thing tunnels in the stems right at the crown level near the ground, so it can affect the whole plant from there on. That's why it's a relatively important one. Cane borer is sort of the same way. And then there's a few other things that occasionally show up. There are a number of fungal diseases. Some of them are on the stem only, but they're very important. Anthracnose is one that you'd really, if you can, get varieties that are relatively resistant to anthracnose. And then others are foliar attacking. Spur blight is also a stem issue. Orange rust is really a funny little disease, and again, that's one that if you can find a resistant varieties is certainly the way to go. They do get this verticillium wilt, which is a fungus that comes through the soil to them, and there's no cure for that once it's in the plants. Gray mold is a direct fungus on fruit. Raspberries are much shorter lived things than tree fruits. Consider them just to be, probably if you really want to have fun growing them and a great crop, expect 5 or 6 years out of them. And then you start getting a buildup of issues. And it's the best thing to do at that point is to renovate and put them in a different place and get a new set of plants. You'll be much better off than trying to struggle through an aging planting. And the virus diseases, which are very significant to them. And many of the virus diseases of brambles are vectored by aphids, meaning the aphids move them around. So even if you're doing everything the very best you can, sooner or later 1 or 2 aphids are going to blow in from the wild brambles, and you'll slowly start getting these diseases, virus diseases in the planting. And that's another reason why don't consider it to be a lifetime thing. It's something that you go and you start over again once in a while. Blueberries. If you've got acid soils down around 4.5 to 5, you're in blueberry country. And if you don't have that, it'll be a constant struggle to keep them alive and productive, so don't even think about it. You want to have fun doing this, right? So, okay. But that's the range for them. Usually sandy soils. There's a number of really good varieties available, and there's probably 10 or 15 more than this that are also some that you can choose from. But you got a broad range of seasons. You can get stuff that comes out a whole month and a half as ripe earlier than the late season one. So a good broad spread. You can be loyal to MSU and get Spartan and stuff like that. This is root tissue is really important in blueberries. They can sometimes look really ugly, and when you buy them, in which case it's best to send them back if they'll take them. It's always a challenge dealing with nurseries, but blueberry root tissue tends to be susceptible to drying out if it's been harvested or dug up too soon and before it's shipped. Be sure you water them in well to settle the soil around the root systems of blueberries. It's good for all these fruits, but real important. Fertilization is kind of different in the blueberry world. They typically don't need much in the way of phosphorus at all. So the 20-0-10-5 kind of mix there is what's often suggested. But again, it's going to depend on your soils, and it's always good to have a soil test done to a planting site before you get into it to see what kind of issues you may have. Now, pruning blueberries is real important, because if you let them grow, they'll grow for a long, long time. The wild blueberries in the woods, they could be 100-year-old plants, but they don't have a lot of fruit on them. And they might be 10 to 15 feet tall, and the fruit's where you can't get at it. So you really have to deal with blueberries. Once you get it up to 2 or 3 years old, start taking out, like in year 4, it doesn't seem like it'd be, like you're wasting some part of the plant. But once you get up to year 4 or so, you don't want all those old ones to start dominating the plant. You want to have 5 to 10 really good mid-age branches coming up out of the ground at all times. The old ones come out. The young ones, let them all come up through the middle of the middle-aged ones. But once they get to be 6 or 7 years old, even younger sometimes, they should be pruned out to the ground. And that's real important. And that keeps the bush height down too. There's a bundle of insect pests of blueberries. If you need information on it, there's lots and lots of references. There's a really good production guide available from Cornell if you want to spend a few dollars. So, and diseases as well. Stem cankers are your biggest enemy. Learning to recognize those, so you prune those out as well when you're doing the pruning time. It's real important. All right. Some people wanted to know about Saskatoons because they're hot new items. And I am the only agent for Michigan State University working on Saskatoons. So if you're going to get anything on them, it's coming from me. So here we go. They are extremely close relatives of what we call Juneberry and serviceberry in terms of the native plant. But the Saskatoon itself is a different species that's more native to western United States. They're really hard to tell apart if you just look at them. The fruit is a pome. Technically, that means they're tiny little apples. They're not little blueberry-like things. The blueberries have, 40, 50 little tiny seeds. Serviceberries and Saskatoons are just like apples. There's 6 seeds in them. Other than that, even though they look like blueberries, they don't need any acidic soils. They grow fine in middle to actually a little bit alkaline. So this allows you to grow a blueberry-like thing in almost anywhere. And sandy, well-drained sites, low nutrition sites, these things thrive. And we're really just starting to get into it now as a commercial crop. Oh yeah, they got a mess of pests. So anything that's closely related to your native creatures, native trees and shrubs is going to have all those lovely native things. Come check them out. The important ones are in red. And so that's it. But that Saskatoons, if you're interested, there's a Saskatoon growers group that is formed now in Michigan. They're looking for people that, even if you just want to put a couple in, they're trying to encourage a big interest in Saskatoon so we can build up a market for the things. So let me know. I can get you in touch with them. And then currants, which almost nobody grows anymore. And there are reasons for that. There's a big disease problem with many varieties of currants that are alternate hosts for a pine tree disease. It was really causing tremendous trouble for white pines in Michigan. So now most of the new varieties of currants are resistant to that disease to avoid having trouble with your currants and trouble with your white pines. So be very careful about your selections of varieties. If you do the right thing, you can avoid problems. And really important to mulch heavily and a lot of organic matter for currants. Strawberries. Anybody really want to grow them? How many minutes now? 8? Okay, we can do a little bit of strawberries. Container grown plants almost always come somewhat root bound. Just about guarantee it. So you got to spend some time massaging that. Because you don't want to just plant them like that plug or they'll stay kind of stuck in their area. Bare root plants are just as valuable then, as far as I'm concerned, because you got to spend so much time dealing with container grown plants. There are June-bearing strawberries traditionally coming into harvest right around June, growing off of last year's plants. But now there are all kinds of other varieties that either bear later or bear somewhat continuously. They don't have such a determinate life history that they only bloom at one time. It's still usually the biggest yields are in the early part of the year, but the everbearing, so-called everbearing strawberries will continue to set flowers and come on with crops well into later times. A lot of people claim that the everbearing ones just don't taste as good as June-bearing strawberries. And it could just be because you're finally waiting for that darn strawberry all year for that one. And if you get them throughout the year, you start saying, it's just a strawberry. There's a little swelling at the base of strawberries, sort of a crown area where the foliage develops upwards and the roots develop downwards. And it should be right about halfway through for good planting height. If you plant that thing too deep or too shallow, they don't survive and bear as well. Now, commercial growers have all kinds of names for their systems for planting strawberries. specific kinds of designs that when they fill in with their runners, it becomes the so-called matted row or the hill system or whatever. But you can plant them however you want to plant them. All of my strawberries are nestled amongst old grape trunk borders that I have around gardens. I work in the grapes so much, I got all this material. And they just grow up between the little twisted old grape canes as an edge planting. And it works just fine. I got a lot of strawberries, and I don't use up any one bed for them. So you just do as you please. And you can plant them in pots and containers and stacked pots. There's all kinds of ways to play with strawberries because they're little plants, and you can almost deal with them like an annual plant if you want to, or a short-lived perennial. So, if you're doing the Juneberry types, the first year remove all their flowers because you want to encourage them to root and send runners. For the everbearings, you can even start bearing stuff late in the fall of the first year. Juneberry plants have a real specific cycle to them compared to everbearings, and we'll talk just really briefly about it. The fertilization's a little bit different, but you got that in the notes. They're called strawberries because most people use straw to protect them for winter cover. It's really important to not use hay. Hay comes with dozens and dozens of interesting seeds in it. If you've ever used hay and straw for different purposes, you know that hay is going to bring you a lot of fun stuff. You want wheat straw or oat straw if you want things relatively clean of weeds. Floating row covers for frost protection in the spring. My little frost pocket is horrible, but I have one beautiful piece of floating row cover, and we can kick out strawberries like crazy by protecting them with that every year. And you can recognize your frost-damaged blossoms. They usually have little black centers in them. So here's the June-bearing. The weird thing about June-bearing strawberries is that they are a renovation period after harvest. We literally mow them to the ground. You can cut them down with pruners or whatever, but on a large scale, you just mow them down as long as you don't injure that little crown zone of the plant. And they regrow into the fall. And once they're done, you get into fall, that's when you cover them with the straw. But if you don't do this to a June-bearing strawberry, they just waste out and fail. They need to have this renovation step. And then, of course, mini pests and critters. So, I'm an entomologist by trade, or by training, so it's hard for me to put a slide of an insect up here and not blab about it, but I'm going to do it. Okay. Okay. And black root rot and red steel root rot are the two things that will take out your strawberries the very quickest if you don't have well-drained sites especially. So those are the diseases to learn to recognize in strawberries. You may have to take a plant out once in a while and see how things are doing. And planting them through plastic is possible too. And that's all the basics of those. And then there's no time for grapes. You're going to have me come back sometime and talk about grapes. There's a lot of fruit to cover, so.